Names like the crumhorn, kirtle, courtault, rouspfeifer and racket are no longer exactly household words. 400 years ago, they were rather more familiar as the ancestors of our modern orchestral reed instruments, the oboe, clarinet and bassoon. I say ancestors as if they're all dead and buried, but it really is surprising just how many of them are still going strong in different parts of the world. If you've ever spent a holiday in Morocco or Turkey or somewhere in the Middle East, well, you've probably heard a sound like this. That was the sound of the Shawm, the forerunner of the modern oboe. It's still possible to earn your living by playing the Shawm in places like Cairo and Istanbul today. The instrument you just heard was something like this. It's got an expanding conical bore with a wide flared bell at one end, and at the other a tiny reed, just a small piece of cane, squashed flat, and then mounted on this metal staple. You take the whole of the reed inside your mouth when you play, pressing your lips against this flat metal disc. It sounds like this. As you can hear, the Shawm was a pretty loud instrument, and it was normally reserved for use out of doors. The first Europeans to hear the Shawm were the first Crusaders, who charged into battle against the infidels and had their ears deafened and their senses terrified by the most appalling sound that they'd ever heard. They subsequently identified it as a 21-piece Shawm band. The typical Saracen military lineup of those days was Shawms accompanied by long trumpets and drums. Anyway, the Crusaders managed to capture some of these strange new instruments and brought them back home to Europe, where they remained in use for over 500 years. Still out of doors, of course. As you could hear, the Shawm was quite a jazzy instrument, good for dance music, and throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, it was used in Europe for ceremonial music of all kinds. Excuse me, I'm rather out of breath. This instrument comes all the way from China. Nearer home, Shawms are still played in Morocco, where this instrument comes from, in France, where this little biniou is used in Brittany with the bagpipe, across the Pyrenees to Spain, where they use this Dulcian, and also in Spain, two mechanized versions of the Shawm, the tiple and the tenora, both complete with 19th century key system. During the Middle Ages, the Shawm developed in a number of important ways. The most important was that the embouchure changed. The embouchure is the way you produce the sound with your lips. On the Oriental type, you don't control the reed with your lips at all, only with the pressure of your breath. On the later European type, the disc was replaced by the funnel-shaped pirouette,
and the reed itself became much larger and more like an oboe or bassoon reed today. Shawmists learned to control the reed with their lips, but the sound was still fairly penetrating. Like most Renaissance instruments, the shawm developed into a family of various sizes. There was the soprano, which you've just heard. There was an alto, a slightly bigger alto with extension keys called a nicolo, the tenor, and the bass, which was really rather an imposing instrument, rather taller than me. Believe it or not, the bass shawm wasn't the largest of the family. There was even a great bass too. A characteristic of these larger shawms is the perforated key cover or fontanelle, and also the metal bands which were added at various points. They were added for protection, really, as well as strengthening, since the shawm came in for some pretty rough usage, particularly in the town bands. One player in the Augsburg town band in the 16th century was fined and imprisoned for assaulting the town bandmaster's son with a bass shawm. A very unpleasant thought. Meanwhile, here's the other really important reed instrument of the Middle Ages. The bagpipe probably started life as a rustic instrument. What more natural for a herdsman who tended sheep or goats and probably played a reed pipe himself to think of combining the two. Yet the Roman Emperor Nero is one of the first performers on the instrument that we know about in history, and certainly no other medieval instrument can claim quite such widespread and continuous use since the Middle Ages. Here are just a few of the bewildering variety of bagpipes which have developed in Europe. The familiar Scottish pipes. The zampogna, which comes from southern Italy and is really the direct descendant of the bagpipes which Nero played. these much smaller Swedish pipes played by shepherds. And this really splendid instrument which comes from Hungary with its marvellous carved animal head. There's a rather nice detail here on the drone pipe with this chap carved on the top of it. And the thing is, if you want to change the note whilst you're playing the piece, all you have to do is to stick in the plug, like that. The basic idea of all bagpipes is the same, to provide a continuous air supply by means of the bag. I'll show you what I mean with this Spanish gaita, which you heard earlier. When you pause for breath, you keep the air going by squeezing the bag with your elbow. You blow the air in through this little blowpipe, which is equipped with a little hinged leather flap, which acts like a non-return valve, so that the air in the bag forces it shut when you stop to breathe. Of course, these things can go wrong, even in the best regulated bagpipes, in which case you get what's known in the trade as feedback. And that feedback on a bagpipe like this, made out of an ancient goat or sheep, can be a rather nauseating experience. Anyway, what else is there on the bagpipe? There's this long drone pipe, which does just what it says, produces one single drone note. Then, on the other side, you've got the chanter, or melody pipe, which is really just like a small shawm, and like the shawm, it's got a double reed. Of course, it's easy enough to get these things to work on their own, but the trouble with bagpipes is you have to get the whole lot to work simultaneously by a process akin to remote control. And of course, not all bagpipes are the same either. If you like to look at this one, which comes from Bulgaria, you'll see that both the pipes are cylindrical, and actually they're both equipped with clarinet reeds, which produces a quite different sort of sound. It really is surprising just how much difference there is between instruments of the Middle Ages and those of the Renaissance. As we've already seen with the shawm, a single medieval instrument could develop into a whole family of different sizes, from soprano right down to bass. With woodwind instruments especially, they produced a phenomenal range of sound, not just by developing different sizes of the same instrument, but by devising entirely new species. Let's just have a look at this tenor shawm. It has a basic range of an octave. You can get a few extra notes at the top by overblowing, and 3 extra ones at the bottom by means of these keys. As you can see, it's a pretty cumbersome instrument, both to make and to play. So at some stage during the 16th century, somebody had the brilliant idea of halving the tube length by reaming out 2 parallel tubes in the same block of wood. The English name for this instrument, the kirtle, tells you exactly the process that happened. The length was curtailed by the use of a double-back tube. The sound starts up here in the little brass crook, goes down one side, round a U-tube, back up the other, and out of the bell at the top. This is actually a tenor kirtle, or Dulcian as it was called on the continent, and it plays right down as low as that tenor shawm and goes up much higher. The sound is a bit softer and more like that of a modern bassoon.
true ancestor of our modern bassoon is the bass Dulcian, this one, which goes right down to bottom C, the same note as the lowest note on the cello. And there were smaller sizes too. This one's an alto, an octave above the bass, and there was even a tiny soprano, an octave above the tenor. The Dulcian, like the bassoon, has an expanding conical bore. But you can make the whole thing a bit more compact if you use a narrow cylindrical bore. And Renaissance makers tried this idea too. The result was the Sordune. This one is a bass, and in spite of its small size, it goes down as low as the bass Dulcian. The idea of a doubled back bore was clearly popular with Renaissance makers, and they took it several stages further with one of the most extraordinary inventions of the period, the racket. The name comes from an old German word rank, meaning crooked, and the racket is just about one of the most crooked instruments ever devised, with not 2 but 9 parallel bores joined alternately top and bottom. Nevertheless, the largest sizes of racket descend to the sepulchral regions of the bottom notes of the double bassoon. One of the most successful developments of the Renaissance was an offshoot of the bagpipe chanter. Now, the thing about the bagpipe is that the reed is separated from the player's lips. You can only control it by means of the air supply. Well, exactly the same thing happens on the crumhorn, except that here there's no bag. You simply blow through a hole in the top of the cap. But the reed is still separated from the player's lips.
altogether, the reed cap idea seems to have been a very popular one, and it was applied to several other instruments too. There was the court-oat, with a double back bore like the Dulcian or Sordune. It's a sad fact that the crumhorn had less than 150 years of useful life, and some of the later windcap instruments less than a century. The far-reaching changes of the early Baroque, the development of opera, the new orchestra, and so on, inevitably swept away any families of instruments with such limited range and no control at all over their volume. Which was a pity, because the windcap instruments especially had a vigorous quality all their own. As you can tell from their names, they were something of a German speciality, and here to end with is a consort of Rauschpfeifen. The name Rauschpfeifer means literally raucous pipe, a not inappropriate name for what is in fact a wind cap version of the Shawm.